All right, Rabbosai, good morning, or good Chodesh. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, Habalin Ladova, Melon, Karen, Ram. We're dedicating the Shiurim and Drushos this month with tremendous Akar Satov to Hashem for all the happiness, blessing, and good He has brought into our lives. Beautiful. Our week of learning sponsors, Steve and Jordana Galaskov, Le'iloi Nishmas, Steve's grandfather, Yitzchak Hirsch Ben Meir, whose 46th yard site is on Gimel Shvat. We hope that the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshav, Shev, and Aliyah, the families in the Chama, all those who need a refuah Shavin together with Kol Cholei Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should indeed continue to shower brachas and hatzlachas upon all of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. With that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Today's daf is daf Ches 8. We are picking up on Zayin Amud Beis, 2 lines up from the bottom, 7b. Actually, 3 lines up, last one on the bottom. Mi Amar Rabbi Lazar Hachi. Did Rabbi Lazar actually say this? Now, what are we referring to over here? If you look at Rashi, Rashi says 3 lines up from the bottom. Mi Amar Rabbi Lazar Hachi Af Bidam. So this is in yesterday's daf. So Rabbi Lazar said that if you go ahead and let's say you take the minimum amount of blood necessary for sacrificial service, you take that amount and you split it up amongst 2 kalims. Even though, again, you have the correct total amount of blood, but you do not have it in one kli sharis. You do not have it in one service utensil. Rabbi Lazar said that halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, the blood is not sanctified. In order for sacrificial blood to be sanctified, you need 2 things. Number 1, the requisite amount. Number 2, all the sanctification, or I should say, all of it collected within one utensil. In kiddusha or in kiddush lechatzoin. There's no partial sanctification. Okay, so now the Gemara says, did Rabbi Lazar actually say that? Vaha itmar. But yeah, we learned Chavite Kohen Gadol. So we'll say interesting case. Once again, if you look at Rashi, one more Rashi, Chavite Kohen Gadol, Asira Sa'iva Shemakrivin B'chol Yom. So we'll say this was the unique mincha offering of the Kohen Gadol, called Chavite Kohen Gadol. Now, what was unique about this? Va'al Shemach Vas Karli Chavitim. Now, ultimately, again, why was it called Chavite Kohen Gadol? Why don't you just call it Minchas Kohen Gadol? It was a mincha, but because it was a minchas machvas. Remember again, a minchas machvas is a shallow pan mincha. Now, what was unique about this, Rabosai, is that part of it was brought in the morning and part of it was brought in the afternoon. So now watch this. Chaviti kohen gadol. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Eina Kiddusha Lechatzon. Rabbi Yochanan says is not sanctified partially. So, for example, we're going to see the amount of flour that you would bring for this was what we call an isaron. So Rabbi Yochanan says if you were to go ahead and sanctify half of the isaron in a kli, in kli A, and half an isaron in kli B, ultimately the carbon is not sanctified. Rabbi Lazar says, "Mitoch shekarva lachatzon, kiddush lachatzon." So it's very interesting. Rabbi Lazar says, "Well, one second. At the end of the day, since it is offered in parts, right? Half of it is in the morning, half of it is in the afternoon. Therefore, you could sanctify it in parts as well." So I'll say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Last Rashi on the daf. Eina lachatzon shemnasan kli chatzi isaron b'kliza v'chatzi b'kliza. Lokidesh v'yatza lechulin. So we'll say, so again, this is a fascinating machlokes. So one more time, Chaviti Kohen Gadol, just because these are important pieces of information to kind of accumulate along our journey as well. Unique mincha offering of the Kohen Gadol was made up of 1 isaron of flour. Half of it was offered in the morning, half of it was offered in the afternoon. So here's the shaila. If you take half an isaron and put it in one kli, another half an isaron and put it in a second kli, does that work? Rabbi Yochanan says no. Rabbi Lazar says yes. Now again, interestingly enough, Rabbi Lazar says, well, hey, since at the end of the day this mincha is offered in parts, so why can't you sanctify it in parts as well? So we'll say it's a top of ches. Now, here's the kasha. What's the kasha? Rabbi Lazar just said before that by dam, by sacrificial blood, You can't do partial sanctification. And yet over here, Rabbi Elazar is saying you can do partial sanctification. So what's going on top of Ches 8a? Vim Isa. Now, if indeed Rabbi Elazar held that there's no partial sanctification of blood, which means if you take half of the requisite measure of blood, put it in one kli, then that put in a second kli, that does not work, leilif midam. That we should learn out from that. We should say just like if you split up the blood, right? You put half in one kli, half in the other kli. Sanctification doesn't work. So too by chavite kohen gadol, partial amounts into kelim shouldn't work either. Okay, that's the kasha. V'chei tema, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Elazar, milsa milsa lo gavar. Maybe Rabbi will say, when it comes to, let's say, sacrificial items or kachim, we don't learn out one thing from the other. That is an interesting idea. Milsa, in other words, maybe in these areas of halacha, these concepts and these ideas are so distinct that you cannot learn out one thing from the other. Vaha Amar Rabbi Elazar, so we'll say, but we're going to see that's not true. Why? Because Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Elazar, mincha shekamsa behechal kshera. So this is very interesting. If you did the kamitza, regular mincha, you did the kamitza of the mincha inside the heichal, inside the actual structure of the Beis Hamikdash. Now, also remember again, where was kamitza normally done? The azara, in the courtyard. If you went ahead and you did kamitza in the heichal, ultimately, again, it's kosher. What's the reason for that? Shekein matzinu besiluk bazichin. Okay, Rabbi said there's a lot of information coming our way now. Why? Because we find this with the removal of the spoons of frankincense. What is that? What is that connected to? The lechem apanim. So remember again, Rabbi said lechem apanim, the showbread. Although I never really understood why that's the definition, but okay, the showbread, right, which is the bread put on the shulchan inside the Beis Hamikdash, was put on once a week and removed once a week, given to the kohanim as they exited their shift. Right, kohanim served for a week at a time in the Beis Hamikdash. Their shift ended on Shabbos. When they left on Shabbos, they got that week's lechem hapanim. In addition, when lechem hapanim was swapped out, there were spoons, literally like really better stated like small ladles, that were placed on the shulchan, filled with levona, frankincense. That was then burned on the mizbeach. Then I will say, here's what's fascinating. The Gemara, Chazal, or at least the Gemara here, Menachos, Menachos, looks at lechem hapanim in the family of mincha offerings, which is fascinating, right? Why is that fascinating? Right? It's, but again, what's the logic? Why put it in the family of mincha offerings? Why put it there? Why? It's flour. That's easy. Even though, again, interestingly enough, so what else would be the connection? Essentially, what kamitza is to a carbon mincha, the levona will be to the lechem hapanim. So that's to just understand this logic over here. So the Gemara says. So now remember, what do we have? Ideally, kamitza takes place in the azar in the courtyard. If you did kamitza inside of the heichal, inside of the Beis Hamikdash itself, you're yotze. Why? The Gemara says because we see the removal of the spoons of frankincense. So the Gemara looks at the removal of the levona, the spoons of frankincense from the shulchan, as the kamitza for the lechem hapanim. Where does that take place? Where does that take place? Inside of the heichal. So just like that quote-unquote kamitza could take place inside of the heichal, so too if you did a regular kamitza inside of the heichal, you're yotzi as well. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that you do learn things out from each other in the realm of sacrificial service. If that's the case, then coming full circle, why not learn out the halachos of the chavitin from the halachos of blood? And just like by blood, we say ein kiddush lechatzoin. You can't put half a measure of blood in one kli, half measure of blood on the other kli. It doesn't combine to sanctify. So to the same thing by chavitin. To which the Gemara says, no. Mincha mi mincha yalif, mincha mi dam lo yalif. No, in the same family you can learn stuff out. But from sacrificial family to sacrificial family, you can't. So in the world of Menachos, you can learn out the halachos of one mincha from another mincha, but you can't learn out, ultimately, again, mincha from dam. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Umincha mi mincha mi yalef." So we'll say, "Ches amud aleph 8a, 5 lines down." Umincha mi mincha mi yalef. But is that true that you can learn out the halachos of one mincha from the halachos of another mincha? Vatani, we learn Ad shelo pirkas, another interesting halacha over here. Ad shelo pirka nifras lachma, halechem pasol, ve'in maktir alav habazichin, esabazichin. So Rabbi said this is really quite interesting. And again, we're going to get this tomorrow's daf, actually, we'll see this. The halacha is like this. Rabbi say, if when you're removing the bread, right, ad shelo parka nifras lachma, if before you removed the bread, the loaf broke. If before you removed the loaf, ultimately again the loaf broke, so that means two things happen. Number one, lechem is possible, the bread is invalid. We'll see what that means in just a moment. The bread is invalid. And number two, you would not offer up the levona. You wouldn't offer up the frankincense. Now, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi is the first short line. Last white line. Achelo parka lema'arechas techapana b'Shabbos. So if before you removed the loaf, on Shabbos, the loaf broke, halechem pasal, Rashi says, the havile mincha shechasra kodem kmitza. So also listen to how interesting this is. The breakage of a lechem hapanim loaf before its removal from the shulchan is the equivalent to a mincha offering whose requisite amount has been diminished prior to kmitza. So we haven't seen this halacha yet, but if you have a mincha and the requisite amount was diminished before kmitza, ultimately again, the mincha is pasul. So Rashi says, "Lechem pasul." The havile mincha shechasra kodem kmitza. V'amina lekaman mina mincha prat l'shechasra ubelechem hapanim gufei amar lekaman. Good. So let's go back to the Gemara. So this is halacha number one. If before you remove the loaf, it's fascinating halachas. If before you remove the loaf from the table. If before you remove the loaf from the table, the loaf broke, so two things happen. Number one, the lechem itself is pasul, and because the lechem is pasul, you can't offer up the bazichin, you can't offer up the frankincense. Misha parka nifras. However, if you removed the bread from the table, and after you removed it, the loaf broke, then what? Lechem pasul, so the loaf itself is invalid. However, umaktir alaves habazichin, but you can offer up the frankincense. So very interesting. Loaf broke on the table, the bread is invalid, and you can't offer up the levona. Loaf broke after being taken off the table. That particular loaf can't be consumed, but ultimately, again, you could offer up the frankincense. Again, I will say, actually, we're going to see this in tomorrow's daf. And Rabbi Lazar says, listen to this. Lo parka mamish. It doesn't mean literally that the loaf was actually physically removed. Ella, kevan she'igiyaz mana lefarek. Once the appropriate time to remove the loaf has arrived, which is when? Which is Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Rashi says over here, Sha'avru sheish shos. It's actually right across. It's not just Shabbos. It's 6 hours into the day on Shabbos. Once the proper time to remove the loaf has come, Apa pi shalo pirka, even though it has not been actually removed, Kimisha pirka damya. It's as if it's been removed. So we'll say, so a major qualification over here. Major qualification. So when we say that if the loaf has been removed, if the loaf breaks, so the loaf is pasul, but the frankincense, the levona, could be offered. Rabbi Lazar says it doesn't literally mean the loaf was removed. Rather, the time for loaf removal has arrived. As long as that time has arrived, then even if the loaf breaks, loaf is pasul, but you can still offer up the levona. Va'amai. I understand why that is. Tehevi k'mincha shechasra kodem k'mitza. It should be no different than a mincha whose requisite shear diminished before Kmitza. And I will say, what's the halacha if you have a mincha? I mean, we haven't seen this yet. We're going to see this tomorrow also. But the halacha is, if you have a mincha whose requisite shear diminished before Kmitza, the mincha's pasul. To which the Gemara says, Halo kasha. There's the big difference. Mincha lo barir breira kometz didei. They both say, by a mincha, ultimately, again, the Kmitza of the mincha is not defined. Can I both say it? When you think about this in just a moment, you have the kli with all of the flour, depending on the type of oil, depending on the type of mincha oil or potentially other additives there. When you look at that kli, you do not know where the kmitza is in there, right? You can't identify the flour that's going to be the kmitza. Therefore, again, if the mincha becomes deficient, right? In other words, you may be able to identify, I'm going to take the kmitza from the left side of the kli, but you can't actually identify which flour is going to make up that kmitza. So halacha l'maisa, again, because of that, if the mincha becomes deficient before the kmitza, the mincha itself is pasul. Masha inkein v'ha barir breira kometz didei. By lechem hapanim, so to speak, the kometz is identified. What's the kometz by the lechem hapanim? What's the kometz? It's the lavona. Well, it's the but remember, it's specifically the lavona, right? The lavona is looked at as the kometz. So because of that, remember, we'll say just to give you the visual, where is the lavona? Where is the levona by lechem hapanim? It's actually sitting on top of the shulchan. There's two, call it spoons, like I said, but it's really little ladles, right? Ladlach that are sitting on top of the shulchan over there. That's so by lechem hapanim, interestingly enough, the kmitza is identified. That's why Rabbi Lazar could say, essentially, once the time to remove the lechem has come, the lechem is as if it's been removed because the kmitza itself is identified. The chayven she'egia zman lefarek kiman deperkadami, and once the proper time to remove the loaf has arrived, we treat it halachically as if the loaf is actually removed, and therefore, again, if the breakage occurs after the time, even though the loaf is actually situated on the shulchan, the loaf is going to be problematic, but ultimately the levona could go ahead and be offered. Elamiyata. But if that's the case, the heavy kishirayim shechasru ben kamitza lahaktara de'in maktir and kometz alehen. But if that's the case, let it be ultimately again like shirayim. And if you have shirayim where the shear diminished between kamitza and haktara, that you can't offer up the kometz on that. Again, Abba will see this all in tomorrow's daf in greater depth, to which the Gemara says, Lav plukten inhu, that itself is a machlokes. And Rabbi Lazar savala kimando amar, and Rabbi Lazar himself holds like the opinion that says, Shirayim shechasru, being kamitza lahaktara, maktir kometz alehen. And Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that says that if you have shirayim, which is the leftover part of the mincha, that became diminished after kamitza, but before haktara, you could still go ahead and offer up the kamitza. Okay, incredible. So I'll say, bottom line, we also did not solve the problem we started with, right? What did we start with? On one hand, we had a statement of Rabbi Lazar. What is Rabbi Lazar's statement? That by dam, by blood, in kiddush lachatzain. There's no such thing as partial sanctification, which means if you take the requisite amount of blood and you divide it up amongst two clay sharis, sanctification doesn't occur. In order for blood to occur, you need two things. Number one, requisite amount. Number two, the requisite amount in one kli. So the Gemara says, then the Gemara brought up the shayla of what about chavite kohen gadol? The mincha offering of the kohen gadol, one isaron of flour. Let's say you put half an isaron in one kli, half an isaron in another kli. Rabbi Yochanan says, doesn't work. Doesn't work. Rabbi Lazar says it does work. What was Rabbi Lazar's logic? Since the minchas chavitin is offered up in parts, half in the morning, half in the afternoon, therefore you can sanctify it in parts. So we got into this whole exhaustive discussion, didn't resolve it. We're back to the drawing board with this. Gufa, let's go. Chaviti kohen gadol. We'll say the Gemara is literally quoting this again. So chaviti kohen gadol, the minchas chavitin of the kohen gadol, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Eino kiddush lachasad. Exactly what we saw before. Rabbi Yochanan said, ultimately, again, there is no such thing as partial sanctification. So if you put half an isaron in one kli, half an isaron in another kli, it's not going to work. Rabbi Lazar says, mitoch shekarva lachatzon, kiddush lachatzon. Rabbi Lazar says, since it is offered in parts, therefore what? It can be sanctified in parts as well. Amar Vacha, my time Rabbi Yochanan. So what's Rabbi Yochanan's logic? What is Rabbi Yochanan's logic? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, mincha machatzisa. The pasuk says literally again, you bring a carbon mincha, and then it will say. So just interesting enough, we're putting the comma a little bit in the different place. The way the pasuk reads is mincha tamid machatzisa baboker umachatzisa ba'erev. You should write it's a mincha. You shall offer half of it in the morning, half of it in the evening. So Rabbi Yochanan reads it as saying, he says mincha machatzisa heavy mincha. First, you have to bring it as a mincha, which means at some point in time, i.e. at the time of consecration, it must be whole. It must be whole, right? It has to be a complete mincha. And then the achar kach chatzehu. Afterwards, then you could divide it up, but it's got to start out as whole. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, Gemara is the kasha, Chavite, Kohen Gadol, Lo Hayu, Baos, Chatzoin. Bryce says as follows: the Chavite Kohen Gadol's mincha would not come in halves. Ella, maybe isaron shalem. You have to bring a complete isaron, and then v'chatzeu, and then afterwards go ahead and split it up. V'tanya, and we learned ilu ne'emar mincha machatzis. If the pasuk would have said mincha or half a mincha, Hayisi Omer, maybe Chatzi Sarmi Beso Shachris Umakriv, Chatzi Sarmi Beso Arvis Umakriv. Now, also one of the other interesting halachas about the Minchas Chavitin is that it has to come from the Kohen Gadol's own money. This is from, so I might have thought like this. If the pasuk would have said, Mincha Machzis, right, literally again half a Mincha, I would have said he brings half an Isar from his home in the morning and offers it up, and then another half Isar from his home in the afternoon, and offers that up. Talmud Lomar Machatzisa Baboker. So therefore, the pasuk says half of it in the morning. Mechza Mishalem Hu Maybe. That Rabbi says, so we dash from the pasuk. No, the carbon must be complete when he brings it. In other words, in the morning when he shows up in the Beis Hamikdash, there must be a complete measure for the chavitin. After then, there's a complete measure. What does he do? He takes half from that for the morning and the remaining half for the afternoon. But it must arrive in the Beis Hamikdash as a complete measure. To which the Gemara says, well, maybe l'mitzvah. Maybe that's l'chatchila, right? So in other words, maybe everyone will agree that l'chatchila, the Kohen Gadol should show up with the entire amount in the morning. But b'diavad, if he only showed up with half in the morning and then brought the other half in the afternoon, perhaps b'diavad, that should be fine. But it says chukah. Now, in general, whenever we see the word chukah, what does chukah tell us? That this is an immutable law, not just l'chatchila, but an immutable law, which would sound like that again. That halacha l'maisa, the Kohen must bring the entire amount, ultimately again in the morning, and then divide it up over the course of the morning and then the afternoon. To which the Gemara says, "Lo nitzach ela lahavia shalem mibeso." To which the Gemara says that what does that teach me? That halacha l'maisa, he must bring the entire amount from his home. Right? So now Rashi says, what does that mean? Abba say? So what the Gemara is suggesting is like this. Yes, he has to bring the entire isaron with him in the morning. But when he sanctifies it, perhaps he can put half of it in a kli shares in the morning and half of it in a kli shares in the afternoon. In other words, we were looking at bringing the total and sanctifying the total as one thing. But perhaps that's in fact two different processes. Perhaps halacha is he has to bring the whole thing in the morning from his home, right? But in terms of sanctification, he can sanctify it half at a time. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan actually say this. Vaha itmar, interesting case. Vaha itmar, hifrish chatzi isar v'daito lahosif. So we'll say, now watch this. Let's say the Kohen went ahead and set aside half an isaron. But his intention ultimately, again, is to add on. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi is right across. V'daito lahosif, lahashlim isaron kidarin lekama perak Menachos v'anasachim, de mincha pechusa me isaron, the omer harei alai chatzi isaron maybe isaron shalim. Now both say, now in this case over here, this is not the minchas chavitin. This is the regular mincha. Now a regular mincha, minimum shear for a mincha is in isaron. That's the shear. So let's say Reuven comes along, and what does he do? He puts a half an isaron in a kli shares. But his das is to add on the rest. That's his das. So what's the halacha? Rav Amar Eino Kadosh. Rav says it doesn't work. Right? Why doesn't it work? Because he doesn't have the requisite shear of flour. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it does work. Now the Gemara says, 1 second. Vim Isa. Now, if this is true, right? If this is true that by chavitin, ultimately, again, you can't go ahead and be mekadesh half an isaron, leilif mechavitin. They learn from mechavitin. I say, just like chavitin doesn't work if you're mekadesh half a chavitin, so too by regular mincha doesn't work either. Dichitema. Rabbi Yochanan, Milsa lo Yalef. So we'll say similar conversation I had before. Maybe you'll say that Rabbi Yochanan, when it comes to sacrificial matters, does not learn out one thing from the other. Rabbi Yochanan, Shlamim sheshachtan behechal ksherin. If you shachted a shlamim in the Beis Hamikdash itself, ultimately again, it is kosher. The Gemara says, Dichsiv, V'shachat Pesach Oel Moed. And interestingly enough, normally, where is the shlamim shechted, right? The shlamim is shechted in the azar, in the courtyard. So why is it that if you shechted it in the Beis Hamikdash itself, that ultimately, again, it's kosher? The pasuk says, V'shachat Pesach Oel Moed. You shall shecht it at the entrance of the Oel Moed. The Gemara says, Shelo Yehei Tafel Chamer Me'ikar. The secondary area could be no more kaddish than the primary area. So the secondary area is the courtyard. The primary area is the heichal. So if shechita works in the courtyard in the azara, certainly it works in the heichal. So we'll say first wide line. Now, what do you see from here? You see from here that you can learn things out from the other in the realm of sacrificial law. So right here, we're learning out the fact that shechita is kosher inside the Beis Hamikdash, from the fact that shechita is kosher in the azara. So you do learn things out one from the others. To which the Gemara says, Daita lahosif shiny. The case of where you put half an isarn in a kli, and your intention is to add on more, that case is treated differently. Why? Disanya. So the Gemara says, Malayim, ain't Malayim ela shleimim. So we'll say, so the pasuk over here says, speaking about the carbonot kara achos shloshim umea mishkala mizrak echad kesef shivim shekel b'shakal chodesh shnehem malayim solas by the carbonot of the Nisim Parashas Naso. So the pasuk says malayim, that by the karban mincha the kli is full. Ein malayim ela shleimim. Ultimately, I will say, what does malayim mean? Malayim means shleimim, means complete. So it tells you by karban mincha, by definition, you have to have the full amount of the mincha in the kli. We also skip the parentheses. V'amrav Yosi, Masai. When is that so? Bizman shein daita lahosif. When do we say that the entire amount of the flour has to be in the mincha? That's when you have no intention to add on. Aval bizman shein daita lahosif. But when your intention ultimately again is to add on Rishon Kadosh, and ultimately again the kli will sanctify as the flour is put into the kli. So in other words, Malayim says you have to have the whole amount. But have the whole amount means, again, that's assuming that whatever you're putting in the kli the first time is what you have in mind to be the mincha. But if you have in mind to keep on adding, right, in other words, that's, you're putting in half, then you're going to add in the other half, then the kli will in fact sanctify as the contents are put inside of it. The Rav, B'chavitin kiman sirele, who would Rav hold in the realm of the karban chavitim of the kohen gadol? Ikar Rabbi Lazar, if he holds like Rabbi Lazar, leilef mechavitin, then enachinami, then learn out this case of mincha from chavitin. V'chitema, Rav milsum milsa lo yalef. Maybe you'll say that Rav does not learn out one topic from another topic. But Rav said mincha kidusha below shemen. Ultimately, I suppose this is actually very interesting halacha. Rav says a mincha can be sanctified even without the oil. Shekein matzinu b'lechem apanim, because you see by lechem, so we'll say lechem apanim is an example of a mincha that doesn't have oil. Right? There's no oil by the karban mincha. So you see from here that a mincha can become sanctified even without lechem. And Rabbi now what this is saying is like this: if you have a karban mincha, and let's say this particular mincha calls for oil, right? So halacha l'maisa, what Rav is saying is like this. Once you put the flour in the kli sharis, even before you introduce the oil, the mincha is consecrated, it's sanctified. Where do we know that? From lechem apanim. Lechem apanim is an example of a mincha that doesn't have oil. So from here you see that a mincha could become consecrated even without the oil. Similarly, below levona, a mincha could also become consecrated even without levona. In other words, if you have a mincha that required levona, the mincha could become consecrated without them. Where do we find that? Minchas nesachim. Because we will say this is a typical mincha. Minchas nesachim is the type of mincha that accompanies a karban. There's no levona in that. So you see from here that a mincha could become consecrated without levona. Below shemen or below levona, a mincha could become consecrated without oil and without levona. Where do we see that? Minchas chote. We will say sinner's mincha only has flour. doesn't have oil or levona. So the point over here is that a mincha, even if a mincha has additional required ingredients, ultimately the kli sharis sanctifies the flour itself. So therefore, also you have to say that Rav really holds like Rabbi Yochanan. Therefore, again, by minchas chavitin, he would also hold that halacha l'maisa, a partial chavitin is not sanctified in the kli. Incredible. Rabbosai, now I'll just point out, so that's the end of that discussion. The Gemara is then going to move on to something else. How do we paskin by the minchas chavitin? Because that was the primary question we were dealing with. Remember again, Kohen has to bring a daily mincha offering, Kohen Gadol, called the minchas chavitin. One isar in a flour has to be brought half in the morning, half in the evening. The Rambam paskins that halacha l'maisa, the entire amount of the mincha has to be consecrated together in a kli. After the entire mincha is put into a kli, then what? Then half of it is offered in the morning, half of it is offered in the afternoon. But consecration must take place with the entire isaron in the kli in the morning. It does come from the Kohen Gadol's own money, right? And therefore, that's how ultimately consecration occurs. So that's how the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yochanan. So I also take something amazing. What was Rabbi Yochanan's logic? His logic was in kedusha lechatzoin. There's no partial kedusha, right? There's no partial consecration. I think it's just important to point out that may be the way that we paskin halacha l'maisa, but not hashkafa l'maisa. So halacha l'maisa, we paskin that there's no such thing as partial kedusha. If you want the mincha to be consecrated, you must consecrate the entire thing at once. Hashkafa l'maisa, we paskin yesh kedusha l'chatzain. There's such a thing as partial kedusha. I was about to say, sometimes just because I'm not doing things perfectly doesn't mean that what I'm doing is not meaningful. Just because I'm living with inherent contradictions, which we all do in the way that I live, there are certain things I do well, certain things I do poorly, certain things I don't do at all. But just because there are things that I'm doing poorly or things that I'm not doing at all doesn't mean the things that I am doing well are not meaningful. Because hashkafa l'maisa, we paskin yesh kedusha l'chatzoin. There is such a thing as partial kedusha. The Ribono Shel Olam does not need us to be perfect. The Ribono Shel Olam does not need us to be spiritually symmetrical. The Ribono Shel Olam just needs us to put in effort. And the good things that we do are not eclipsed or overshadowed by the wrong things or inconsistencies we have in our life. This is so incredibly important. So halacha l'maisa, ein kedusha l'chatzain, hashkafa l'maisa, yesh kedusha l'chatzain. Do whatever you're doing, even though, again, there's a lot of things in a state of spiritual disrepair, because the things that we are doing well are so meaningful and so beautiful and so holy, even though they're only l'chatzain in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Incredible. All right, boss, weiter. Gufa, Amarav, mincha kedusha below shemen. So I'll say, so remember again, Gemara is just quoting what we just saw before in Rav. So Rav said that if you have a mincha, and let's say it's a mincha that requires oil, when you put it in the kli sharis, even though you have not added the oil, the mincha is kaddish. Because lechapanim is a good example of a karban mincha that doesn't have oil and yet it's still kaddish below levona. Similarly, again, if you didn't add in the levona into the mincha is also kaddish. Why? Shekematzina b'minchas nesachim below shemen. Because the minchas nesachim, remember again, that's a typical mincha that accompanies a karban. Ultimately, it does not have levona. Below shemen and below levona. Even if you have a mincha and you didn't add in the shemen or the levona, but you put the flour in the kli, the mincha is consecrated. Because that's the sinner's mincha. So I'll say, the idea that Rav is coming to introduce to us is that if you have a mincha that has other additives, even if you didn't add those additives, once the flour is put in the kli sharis, the mincha is kaddish. Mincha is kaddish. That's what Rav is coming to say. The Gemara says, shemer levona, kadshe high below high. The high below high. Similarly again, if you have oil and levona, oil can become consecrated without levona, and levona can become consecrated without oil. Where do we see that? Shemen shekematzina below shemen shel oil, because remember again, there is a lug of oil that is consecrated for use of the metzora, right? Remember again, that's the oil applications on the metzora. Levona shekematzina levona haba'a bebazichin. Levona, because remember again, levona because it's on the ladles, on the shulchan for the lechem apanim, and it is offered separately of anything else. Incredible. Rabbi Chanina says, on the other hand, and we'll say Amud Beis, Rabbi Chanina Amar, Amud Beis, lo zu kiddusha below zu, below zu kiddusha below zu. So both say, interestingly enough, so Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Chanina disagrees. Rabbi Chanina says, not true. It's not true. Anytime a mincha requires additional additives, in order for the mincha to be kaddish, all the additives must be placed in the kli sharis. So whatever, fill in the blanks, whatever you need. You have a mincha that requires shemen, so if you want the mincha to be kaddish, ultimately, again, the shemen must be introduced into the kli sharis together with the flour. Look at the top Rashi on 8b. Lo zu kiddusha below zu. B'chala menachos hatu'unos shemen levona. Ein kli sharis mekadesh echad mehem ela imkein shlashtan yachad bekli. So this is ultimately again how Rabbi Chanina paskins that in order for a mincha to be consecrated, all of the ingredients must be put in the kli sharis. Just so you understand, just the tremendous nafkamina in this, right? Let me just illustrate this for you. Imagine for a moment you have a mincha, and the mincha requires flour, shemen, and levona. Just for argument's sake, right? And now what happens? You put the flour in there, and then you change your mind. I don't want to give mincha, so I don't want to pledge this flour. So according to Rav, done. You can't do that. Once the flour hits the kli sharis, we're done. According to Rabbi Chanina, it would sound like halacha l'maisa. Potentially, you could take the flour back out because the mincha is not consecrated until the mincha and all of its ingredients go into the kli sharis. Incredible. So let's go back. It says Gemara Rabbi Chanina, lama nimshach. So according to Rabbi Chanina, ultimately again, look at Rashi for just a moment. Rabbi Chanina isaron shaisav mikdash letzorach menachos kidam perak shleinis lama nimshach. B'shem HaMishcha, Kedei Lekadesh Es Hanasa Mesocha, Alo Eino Miskadesh Klum Rabbi Chanina, Dei Machzik Lo Shem V'Lo Levona. I suppose to say, here's the problem. According to Rabbi Chanina, there was a kli, there was a utensil that ultimately held in Isaron. Right? Now, that kli is great for what? What is it great for? Flour. Right? Now remember, minimum shear of any carbon is important information. Minimum shear of any carbon mincha is an isaron of flour. An isaron. Now, there was a kli in the Beis HaMikdash that measured exactly an isaron, which is great. That's great for flour. What can't you add into that kli? Any other additives. So here's what's interesting. That kli was consecrated. It was anointed, which means ultimately, again, that halacha l'maisa, it operated as a kli sharis. So I understand. According to Rav, that makes a lot of sense. Why? Because according to Rav, when does a mincha become consecrated? When? As soon as you just put the flour in. Great. So you have an isaron utensil, which holds an isaron of flour. Perfect. Put it in there. It's kadosh as a karban mincha. According to Rabbi Chanina, the only time a karban mincha is consecrated is when? When all of the additives are in. If that's the case, then the isaron kli doesn't need to be a kli sharis, because the flour is not consecrated until you put everything into a larger kli that could hold the shemen levon afterwards. So if that's the case, according to Rabbi Chanina, why was the isaron kli consecrated as a kli sharis? Which is absolutely incredible. First Gemara says, not a problem, the minchas chote. No, because remember, even according to Rabbi Chanina, there is a mincha that has no additives. What's the mincha that has no additives? That's the minchas chote. That's the sinner's mincha, right? The sinner's mincha ultimately, again, has zero additives associated with it. Incredible. So therefore, again, that kli work for that mincha. V'log lama nimshach. The lug utensil of oil. Why was that consecrated? Because according to Rabbi Chanina, the lug of the oil is only meaningful when mixed into the rest of the kli sharis. What is it doing? Why does it need to be consecrated? To which the Gemara said, lug shal matzora. No, because remember again, everyone agrees, aside from mincha, you need a lug of oil for the process of a metzora. That is needed and necessary. That's why it was consecrated. V'af Shmuel Silber laha the Rav, and even Shmuel agrees with Rav. Namely, remember, Rav holds that a mincha is consecrated as soon as the isaron of flour is put into the kli, even if the other additives are not included. Disnan kli halach mikachines halach. It's actually interesting halach over here, to which the Gemara says, kli halach. If you have a utensil that is used for like liquid measurements, it consecrates liquids, Umidos hayavesh, and the utensils that were used as dry measurements, mekachnes hayavesh. They consecrate any dry items. Right? So ve'ein kli halach mekachnes hayavesh. Ultimately, again, a utensil used for liquid measurements does not consecrate any, call it dry items. V'lo hayavesh mekachin es halach. And ultimately, again, the utensils used for dry measurements do not consecrate liquids. Shmuel said, Lo shanu ela midos. That's true measuring utensils. Ava mizrakos sheldam mekachos es hayavesh. But listen to this. Mizrak is literally like a bowl. The bowls that were used to contain the blood, ultimately, again, that is mekadesh even the dry items. Shene'emar, shnehem maleim solas, belula b'shemen lamincha. Incredible. So Moses says that's just the raya that ultimately, again, Shmuel holds like Rab, namely, that ultimately, again, a klisharis will be mekadesh, the mincha, even when it's just the flour without the additives. Incredible. Good. So the Gemara goes on. Mincha lachahi. So a mincha, in general, interestingly enough, is considered to be a liquid item. Ultimately, again, it's only necessary. The Gemara says mincha lachi is mincha considered to be a liquid item. It's only needed to teach us regarding ultimately the dry part of it, i.e., the flour, and not the other additives. So I'll say, skip the parentheses. Mincha legabe dam ki yavesh damya. The other possibility is that when you compare mincha to dam, so again, even though mincha has liquid parts, ultimately, again, mincha is considered to be a yavesh when compared to blood. Okay, so we'll say, so just kind of to close the circle over here. So how do we paskin? At what point in time does a korban mincha become consecrated? Rav says as soon as you put the flour into the klisharis, even though the additional ingredients are not there, the flour is sanctified as a korban mincha. Rabbi Hanina, not until you go ahead and you introduce all of the ingredients to the mincha is the mincha consecrated. I will say Rabbi Paskin, the Rabbi Paskin is like Rabbi Hanina. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the mincha itself is only consecrated when all of the ingredients are added into the klisharis. So Rabbi says, let's just begin the next part. Gufa, Amar Belazar. Mincha and Habosai, this is very exciting because really we just had this brisa before. The Gemara is just kind of picking apart all of it. Let's at least start this today and then we'll stop. Anyways, you know what? We'll stop over here for today. We'll stop with this Gufa. We'll pick up at Meretz Hashem with this remaining Gemara tomorrow. What a start! What a start! A good Chodesh. Habosai, incredible. Habosai, I just want to point out this is actually one of these Gemaras today, where even though we go kind of quickly, we absorb a lot of information. There's so much here. If you have a couple of minutes today to chazer, and it's a legal holiday today. I don't know who's off, who's not off, right? But Lamaisa, take 10, 15 minutes of chazara. This is one of these Gemaras that really you could assimilate and really get all this information. Shkoyach. All right. Chavra on Zoom. Have a great day, everyone.